Hello everybody, I'm Miss Lisa. Welcome back to another episode of Drawing for Kids. Today I'm going to start teaching a few classes about how to draw landscapes because they're super fun to do. And if you also want to know how to paint landscapes in watercolors, you can tune into the Watercolor for Kids classes on Wednesdays because I will be showing you how to paint something similar to what we're drawing on Tuesdays. Okay, so what is a landscape? A landscape is a painting or drawing of something with having to do with nature and the outdoors. So if you go camping or hiking, or even if you're in the car driving along as a passenger and you see these beautiful mountains or you see fields and little stream, anything that really inspires you to want to stop and draw or take a photograph. Sometimes the clouds are amazing, aren't they? You might be driving along and looking out the window and seeing a field, and all of a sudden there's big, beautiful, billowing clouds that are so beautiful. You just really want to stop and take a picture at least. But if you happen to have your sketchbook, you might want to draw a quick sketch of the scene and then come back home and draw it in more detail and then maybe paint it someday. So that's the idea. Though for those of you that have had me as a teacher, you know that when our paper is in this orientation, I call it landscape. And when it's in this orientation, we call it portrait. And that's because portraits are usually drawings or paintings of people, often from the head and shoulder view. And so if you turn your paper this way, you have space to get the head and shoulders into your paper or canvas. If we turn the paper this way, we get a nice horizontal space to put in a big scene. And this is more appropriate for drawing or painting from nature. So in this example here, I've just done a quick sketch of some mountains. Probably it could be what the Sierras might look like from up closer than we normally see it from here in Merced or in Outwater. If you look all the way to the Sierras, they're very far in the distance. But if you get closer to them, they might look something more like this. So I'm going to show you how to do something like this. And then we're going to take that view and push it into the background. So we have a middle ground here, and we can start to think about what we would want to put into the middle ground. And then just to let you know, there's also a foreground. We can add something else here. And the idea with landscape is that you want to try to create a 3D space that you feel like you can go into. So in realism, we take a 2D, a two-dimensional photograph or scene in our head, and we want to make it look three-dimensional. And there's different ways that we can do that. So let's grab a pencil or some pencils and a piece of paper, and let me start telling you how we can start to get that feeling of space. So I have got my pencils here, my 7H, my 5H, and my HB. I won't be using these today because I know those are hard for you to see in my videos. I'll be working mostly with the 2B, 3B, 4B, and 6B. And with those four pencils, the 2B being the lightest and the 6B being the darkest, I'll try to make these mountains feel like we can go into the picture and see these different layers of mountains. And when we paint something like this, it's a little bit easier because we'll have color to work with as well. But in pencil, we have light and dark. And so we're going to be using light and dark to draw something that our brain can interpret as being closer and further. And so if we have things that seem closer and things that seem further away, we will feel that there is a progression of near to far, and that makes us give the illusion of having 3 dimensions, because it seems like you can go into the picture instead of just looking at a flat picture on the table here. So let's get our piece of paper, and we're just going to make some very simple mountaintops. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 ridges of mountains and hills here. And so we're going to do that with our pencil, and basically just using not a really dark zigzag line, but we're going to think about making a mountaintop range, a range of mountaintops that might look somewhat natural. So maybe something like this. You know, in nature there's a lot of variation, right? So I don't want it to be just a zigzag line. I want to give it a little bit of character. So this is my first line here. And we're going to make 3 more. And try to make your next one different than this one. So the one that I drew first goes up and then down, a little up, down, and a bigger up and down. So I want this one maybe to start out going down, because the other one started out going up. And I'll put a little bit of an up place there. And maybe it's going to go down here where my other mountain range goes up. Okay, so now I've got 2. And this one is furthest in the distance. This one is coming along next. And then I'm going to make another one. And again, I want it to be different than the 2 that I've just drawn. So I'm thinking about how to make it look different. And I've got 1 more. And this one, I think I'll make it a little bit more rounded, because this is we'll call this the foothills now. And the hills tend to be not as jagged as the mountaintops. Hills are more rounded in my mind. So now we have this line here that represents the furthest mountaintops away from us. And then we have another row of mountains in front of that. And we have another row of hills or mountains in front of those 2. And here we have the closest hills, the foothills. We'll call them the foothills. And now what we're going to do, I want to tell you that when you see things in the distance, way far away, like the Sierra Crest, they're going to look very, very light and not very distinct, because you have to see them over a distance. So we're going to leave that very light, and then this will be a little bit darker. This one will be darker still, and this one will be the darkest of all. And because this is closest to you, you can see more detail here. So maybe I'll extend this line down to form a valley. So now it looks like there's a valley here. And maybe I'll extend this line down to make another valley here. And maybe we can even see some tiny little trees up here. But let's go back to this far away mountain range. So now what I want to do is just define the top of the mountains with some shading, but I don't want to make them too dark, because we know this is far in the distance. And if you want to, you can turn your paper and go the other way as well. We won't be able to see any trees because it's so far away. And oftentimes there's kind of almost like a mist. If you go out and look at the mountains, you'll see that you can sometimes see layers of mountaintops, but this part is kind of white and you can't really see very much. It looks like one row of mountains is kind of floating above the other. So again, I don't want to make this line too dark because we want to give it the illusion that it's far in the distance. I just want to add enough of my pencil to this paper so that I don't see an obvious line. What I see now is some mountaintops in the distance. And then I'm going to leave this part white to indicate that it is far away. I'm not seeing a lot of detail. And then I'm going to come down to this line here. Now this one is closer to us, so we can add a little bit more darkness to the pencil, and we can perhaps see a tiny bit of detail, but I'm not even going to do any detail on this one. I'm going to keep this one similar to this one because I want it to be in the distance too. But I'm going to make it just a little bit darker. And I could switch to my 3B pencil because I know that's darker, or I can just press down a little bit harder with my 2B pencil. And again, I just want it to look like the tops of a mountain range, but I don't want to give it too much detail. So it's going to be slightly darker. I want it to look like tops of mountains and not a zigzag line. So by adding this little bit of shading with my pencil, suddenly they become mountaintops. And again, I want to leave this white area here to make it look like we have different layers of mountains. This is super fun to do with watercolor paint. So I hope you get a chance to watch the watercolor videos. Tomorrow's video is actually going to be talking about green because when you do landscapes, you use a lot of green. The green color is one that you will use a lot because you're painting scenes from nature, and we only have one color of green in our paint box, in our Crayola paint box. So I'm going to show you how to make different kinds of greens, but after that, I'm going to be showing you how to paint some cool landscapes. So I hope you're able to watch the watercolor videos too. And between the drawing the drawing landscape classes and the painting landscape classes, I hope you'll learn a lot. I'm trying to make these look like the darkest part of the mountain is just along the top edge of them, and then it's going to get lighter as I go down. Similar to how I did this one, only this ridge is going to be darker than this one because it's closer to the viewer. It's closer to us. Okay, so now we've got 2 layers of mountains done, And now I'm going to go down to this layer, which could be another layer of mountains in front of these two, or it could be the highest of the foothills. We're going to do the same thing again, but we're going to make it darker. And this time I'm not going to add so much of the white. I won't leave so much white because this is closest to us. I'm just going to add a little bit so that it is distinct from this layer down here. Remember, if you want your pencil to draw darker, you just have to press down a little bit harder on it. And turn your paper where you need to. Now we can see maybe a little bit of detail in this mountain here, in this mountain range or range of foothills, because it's closer to us. Let's say we can visualize a little bit of a valley here. We can darken that area. Maybe we can see a little bit of valley here. Maybe a little bit of valley here. So just by pressing down on my pencil, I'm able to make this look like a valley and a little bit of a valley here. And I'm going to move on to my slightly darker pencil now, my 3B, and I'm going to do this last range of foothills in the same way, but adding again more detail. So maybe here you can see I started to draw a valley. I can darken that area. So it looks like you're going down, you can go down into it. A valley you would be able to go into if there was a trail or a road. So by darkening that area, it gives it some depth. Now the next time you happen to see the Sierras, look at those distant hills and tell me if they look blue or green or brown. And you will probably tell me that they're kind of bluey gray, and that's one way that we can make things look far away, is to make them grayer or slightly bluer in color, blue-gray, because the atmosphere has a lot of particles in it, and that makes vision over long distances a little bit fuzzier and hard to distinguish because the colors are gray and lighter. And so these distant mountains, you want them to look light and less distinct. If I was painting this, I would leave that edge a little bit fuzzy by using the watercolor paint with more water, so you know you get that feeling of the color moving away from your brush. And so some of that might just get a little bit fuzzy on the edges, and certainly down here. I'll show you when we paint one. We want this to be very fuzzy going into whites at this point. Same here. This edge may be slightly fuzzy. These edges here are closer to us, so we would want these to be sharper. And down here, we have less area that we want to retain the white of the paper. Maybe we can see this valley. And maybe on this closest range, we'll see some trees. Just kind of sketch in a couple tree shapes. This looks like a scene out of the forests and the mountains in Oregon, where they have lots of fir trees, where my mom used to live. And her house had windows that would look out over the mountains. And this is pretty much the view. I'm drawing it from memory. I mean, not every single shape is right, but there were these layers of mountains, and you could see the trees in the foreground. You could see these trees closest to you, but in the distance, of course, even though you know there's trees on those mountains, you wouldn't be able to draw them. They'd be so tiny. Okay, so there we go. Our first landscape is completed. Now what I want to do is show you that you can take that same idea and we're going to make this smaller in the background so that we create a whole middle ground here. And we'll talk next week about what we would put in the middle ground, but I'll give you some examples today. So we're going to do the same sort of thing here. We're going to make, so with a different piece of paper, I want you to make some mountaintops. We're going to make them not so big now because we're going to squish them all down into this part of the paper. In fact, if you want, you can start by drawing a horizontal line about a third of the way, maybe a little bit more than a third of the way down your paper. And I've just very lightly sketched out on my paper already where this horizontal line is going to be and where these mountaintops are going to be. I'm not following my plan exactly. Okay, so there's my first line of mountaintops. Now I'm going to make a second line that's going to be different than this one. So this one started out up and then came down. I don't really want to start out the second one up and down. I'll try something different. I'll do something like this. Because you know, everything in nature has a lot of variation. So the shapes of mountaintops, the colors, maybe this one comes all the way down like this. And actually I want this one to come down about a third of the way along your horizontal line. Make this line come down and then go back up. So there's a little place where, and there's a couple places along this lower set of foothills where it comes down to the line and goes back up a bit. So just like this case here, we have 4 different layers of mountains and or foothills. And we're going to do the same kind of shading that we did here. So let's do that again. So on this first layer, we want to use light pressure so that we get a light grayness from our pencil. If I press down harder, that would be a lot darker. And I don't want to come all the way down to the second layer of mountains. I want to leave a bit of space because I want it to look like these mountains are very much further away, and that little bit of white will look kind of like almost like a fog that separates the two mountain ranges, and it will push this one further back. So we'll feel like this mountain range is way in the distance. And again, when I paint this, if I paint something like this mountain range is going to be bluey gray, very light bluey gray, to make it look far away. This next row of mountaintops, I'm going to make them a little bit darker. Just extend that out to the edge. And all I'm doing really is using my pencil to shade in the tops of the mountains or that ridge of mountains so that they don't look like a jagged line any longer. They look like they have some substance. They look like they could be mountains. Drawing and painting is, when you do realism, it's all about illusion. Illusion means you're trying to make something look like something that's not really there. And so the illusion that you're trying to create when you do realism in drawing or painting is that you've got maybe 3 dimensions when you only have 2. You know that your drawing is only 2 dimensions, but you're trying to give it another dimension. You're trying to give it some space. You want it to feel like it's going back. I'm just going to add some more pencil so that the white isn't so noticeable in the second layer. And now I'm going to go on to the third layer. And this one is even darker. And now we've got the very closest foothills. So for those, we know that we can add, it's still pretty far away, but maybe there's just a little bit of a hint that there's some valleys in some of these places. It's a little bit different than this view here because the first one that we drew, the whole thing is the foothills at the front of the drawing are very much closer to us than they are in this case. So in this second one that we're doing, we still can't put too much detail in the closest foothills because they're still far away. They're much further away from us than they are in this drawing, just because of the perspective that we've used. Okay, so do you see what we've done now? We've taken this view here and we've squashed it all down and put it there. So now this whole bit has been squashed down into about the top third of our second drawing here. And that leaves us this whole big area down here. So you can imagine that maybe there would be fields of wheat, or there's some cows out there, or maybe there's a farm, maybe maybe this is the road to Mariposa. Okay, you can sort of think about what it might represent, and we've got this whole area that we can put things into in our landscape. Now, one thing that landscape artists often do when they have this sort of view where they're looking far in the distance and there are oftentimes some mountains back there, just so that you know, it sort of tells your brain, yes, this is a far in the distance view and there's some mountains in the background. But to help you pull yourself into the painting or drawing, they will add something, maybe there's a road that goes in the distance, or some train tracks, or a path. If it was hiking trails, maybe they would show some trails that sort of wander around from here into the mountains. But I'm just going to take this part where we made it come down to the horizontal line, and I'm going to make 2 diagonal lines just to show you what would happen. Okay, if we do something like this, and we just put like a little dashed line down the center of it, and these dashes get longer as they come towards you, isn't that amazing how suddenly it looks like a road that's taking you from here all the way in to the picture. And then the road disappears in the mountains. Maybe it goes into the mountain pass. Maybe it goes up to Mariposa. It's pretty cool how that works. Now, when you look from close to far, the things that are closest to you are going to appear to be much larger than the things in the distance, although you know that they're the same size. So when I draw the lines in the center of the road, I would actually want to draw them maybe even wider here and longer, and then they would get shorter and narrower. And that also helps you feel like you're going into the drawing. I'm just going to take my eraser and I'm going to change this. So instead of a road, if I added some horizontal lines like this that are closest together, really close together, and then become further apart as we get closer to the viewer. And not only are they further apart, but we can add more detail because they're closest to us. So if we now do something like this, suddenly it looks more like a railway track, right? And that would be pulling you into the drawing or painting. Now, another way to get that sort of effect of being pulled in is to use a curved line that would represent a stream, for example, or also hiking trails. Curved lines are good for hiking trails. So maybe there's actually a little stream. And we could do that with a curved line. Maybe it's a little S shape. Remember, it has to be wider down here to make you feel like you're going into it, and it has to be just a point at the other end. So something like this could be a path, or it could be a stream. But you get the idea. You can use something from the foreground going down to a point at the horizon line where you will increase the apparent size of this space. You can make this look like this is really massively big if you use these kinds of lines to pull the viewer into the picture. I'm just going to modify this slightly because I want this whole bit to be smaller and this whole bit to be bigger, and that will really enhance that feeling of going into the picture. Okay, so that's your introduction to landscape. We learned that, I just want to say one more thing here. So once we get to this stage, when we're thinking about something like this and being pulled into the drawing, you've got this whole area that you can use like a play. What's going on in that area? Are there just animals grazing in the fields? Is there a farmer and a farm? Are there other kinds of grasses and trees? Is it a whole bunch of trees? Is it a field of hay? Are there haystacks? You can think about all the things that could be happening here. But basically, when you go into a big view like this, you can almost think of this as a stage and this as the backdrop, if that makes sense. So if you have been in a play, you know that there's a bit far in the back, and we'll call that the background, but it's like the backdrop on a stage. Move that so you can see it. So this is like the backdrop or the background, and then there's the stage. Now this is called the middle ground. So in the middle ground, you might have fields, haystacks, farm buildings, houses and cottages, lakes and boats, or if this was up in the mountains, you might just see some mountain range at the back, and in the middle ground, you might see waterfalls, big rocks, stuff like that. And then in the foreground, you would have more detail. So maybe you would see right up here closest to the viewer, you might see flowers on the start of the path. You might see a big tree that it might even start outside the picture frame, or it might start here. Now this tree, if you draw it this big, it's going to make this space go way back, because you know that if you compared a tree this big to the size of these mountains, that it would be way out of proportion, right? Because if the mountains are thousands of feet tall and they look like this, you can't have a tree that's 4 times or 5 times as tall as the mountain. That just wouldn't work. But your brain is able to interpret something very large, starting way down here or outside the picture frame, as being way in front of what you're looking at behind. So it really increases that depth of space. So I hope that helps to clarify landscapes. And I find it useful when I teach kids to think about the stage. I think this helps everyone visualize what's going on. So if you have something far, far away, think of it as being on the backdrop behind you. And then as you work forward from the backdrop and you're on the stage, stuff is happening. You can make almost like a story. Maybe there's a farm and some horses and somebody riding a horse and somebody cutting the hay. Maybe there's some haystacks over here. Maybe, well, you get the idea. Some story could be happening on the stage. And then in the very front here, right in front of the audience, you might have something big, and that just helps push the rest of the view behind, and that expands the space that you're working with, if that makes sense. So next week I'm going to show you some pictures of landscapes, and we'll talk about what I showed you today, and we'll talk about the background, middle ground, and foreground, just to help you visualize what we're doing. And I will lead you through a landscape drawing where we put something on our stage. Okay, and maybe we'll put a couple things. We'll see how the time goes. Until next week, I want you to take care. I want you to wear your mask when you go out and wash your hands well when you're in, and socially distance, practice your art, and I'll see you next time. And remember, if you want to learn about variations in green so that you can learn to paint landscapes in the future, make sure that you watch tomorrow's video. It's called Variations in Green. Take care. Goodbye.